Hey guys. Hi. I thought we would just go ahead and start. Hi, I'm Joscelin Cooper. I work at Airbnb. I'm going to be talking to you today about creating trust and belonging through onboarding. And I use a couple of quotes from writers whose work I really appreciate throughout as kind of a device for illustrating some of my points. So if you want reading recommendations, those are probably the places to take notes. I personally think that one of the best ways to practice becoming a better writer is to read a lot. So first of all, this is my title. I'm a content strategist. So why do I have this in quotes? So I really am uncomfortable with this title. I don't really like it. I think it has some shortcomings. Why? Because it's abstract and it's sort of meaningless. Because what is content? Like, content is a lot of things. It's kind of a generic term. It's everything from like the Kardashians to social media to like, the words that are in a UI to the entire works of Shakespeare. So content is a lot of stuff. And content strategy, okay, so that sounds good, that sounds important. But like the problem with bad terminology is it doesn't stand alone. It necessitates explanation, it necessitates definition. So over the course of this presentation, one of the things that I really want to drive home is that it's really important what we call things, and the words that we choose are super important. So designers, researchers, engineers, part of the power of having a title that kind of like gives agency to what you do, it gives you a verb, it references the output of your work. And so for content strategy, like, what is it that we do? Like, at the core of it is we produce words. We're writers. So, of course, designing is more than just like moving lines around and picking color palettes and setting typefaces, and so is writing. It's storytelling, information architecture, even helping teams articulate a vision. And I think that actually, like, in this way, designers and writers have a lot in common. I think that we both do this work. Writing is the result of many kind of decisions and negotiations, and I would argue that writing is a design discipline. So I want to call attention to Anne Lamott, who is a wonderful writer who writes a lot about the actual craft of writing, and she has this essay called Shitty First Drafts, which is about exactly what it sounds like. And she basically advises writers to just kind of like, lose the self-consciousness, to just get it out there on the page, and then trust that through their process, they'll be able to structure their work, that they'll be able to work towards a final polished piece. And so kind of like the reason that I bring this up and I want to talk a little bit about process is writing like design it's a technical skill that involves some calculation and structural thinking, but it's also an art form. And because it has this duality, I think that, as a discipline within product design organizations, we've kind of struggled a little bit to gain legitimacy and to prove the importance of the words to the design process. So, I think part of our job as writers on design teams is just to prove the value and the point of good content. So, content shapes the experience. I think that this has been said in many different ways, in many different mediums lately. People are like, content is king, like content-centered design. And I think that these types of articles and this conversation is really important. But I think that, though well-intentioned, it's still sort of just lip service. It's not really the reality of how we work within, the product design process. And so, like, through this presentation, I'm not going to explicitly make an argument for, like, why a content should shape the experience. I think that that's kind of implicit and hopefully comes out in my examples. So, to kind of make the argument for content's primacy, we have to first look at what is good. Like, what is good content? And so I spend a lot of time thinking about this, not just what's good, but, like, what makes for a good collaboration between writers and designers. So this essay by designer Travis Gertz, who has an agency called Louder Than 10, it kind of made my head explode, and I recommend looking it up. He has a lot of really kind of provocative ideas, some of which I don't agree with. But here he's talking about, the danger of bad content. And, the fact that it doesn't really merit design. There isn't a symbiotic relationship when you have, bad content out there in the world. So what's good? So again, short beats good, perhaps. I worked at Google before I was at Airbnb, and I had a mentor, her name was Sue Factor, and she was one of the first UI writers at Google. She wrote the OSNAP on Chrome, and just a lot of kind of like little details that made it delightful. And so she wrote this seminal document called Short Beats Good, and this is really like, this is it. This is the gist of the entire document. And for a company like Google, where they create kind of like very either complex products like AdWords or like very task-oriented products, like this is really good writing advice, because you kind of just want to inject meaning straight into the brain of their user. You don't want them to have to think too much to figure out, or you don't want them to have to read. Good could be that a lot of people clicked on it or liked it, that it was popular. Simon Rich is kind of a prodigy. I recommend that you look up the Shouts and Murmurs. It's completely delightful. It could be that it elevated an experience that's kind of like, just transactional to something that was delightful. Again, this is some copywriting from a friend of mine for a grilled cheese chain in San Francisco. It could mean that a lot of people, bought something, or there's some sort of conversion. Just because something is popular doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. So I kind of tried to think through, like across a lot of different types of writing, and like just all different types of mediums, what are kind of like 3 principles that unite them all? Like what makes good writing? And you're free to disagree with me about these. This is just kind of like a departure point for discussion. So I would say simplicity, no unnecessary words. George Orwell wrote this essay called Politics in the English Language, and he gives us like 5 tips for writing. And one of his tips is actually, if it's possible to cut out a word, cut it. So, I mean, that's just pretty clear and straightforward. There should be only essential words in good writing. Next, it has structure, which is context, story, rhythm. I'll go into that a little bit more. And then there's flow. There's no effort in reading it. It doesn't pain you to find the meaning. So, structure. This example is Ernest Hemingway's 6-word novel. So the story goes that he was sitting around with a bunch of writer friends at the Algonquin, like drinking martinis or whatever they do. And someone bet him that he could not write a novel in 6 words, so he wrote this, and he won the bet. So, this is kind of amazing because it has structure and pathos and mystery, and it's all just in 6 words. And also to my third point about complexity, I don't mean that, like, novelists who write, like, complex, deep works of fiction that require some time and attention, I don't mean that that's not good. I just mean that, like, we've probably all had an experience with either, like a terms of service or academic text where you have to really struggle to find the meaning and you're just kind of like your eyes are glazing over. That probably wouldn't fall into my qualification for what good writing is. So now bringing this back to Airbnb, what's good at Airbnb? I want to talk a little bit specifically about our mission statement, which is belong anywhere. The reason I want to talk about it is because there's kind of a bridge that we have to make as writers at Airbnb between this kind of like aspirational, big ideas that we put forth in our marketing and kind of like the more practical language that we use in the UI to actually help people get things done. And so, like, this mission statement can be a little bit problematic because it's a big idea. It's a little vague and solipsistic. But if we're to give it the benefit of the doubt, it's really bold and visionary and humanitarian. So, kind of getting back to the challenge, which is like, how do we write product experiences given this landscape? Jessica Collier is a friend, and she was one of the first UI writers at Evernote, actually. And she's written a lot of really interesting articles on Medium, actually, kind of about the craft of UI writing and writing for products. And she coined this term narrative UX, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the development of a narrative user experience. And that's how she kind of defines UI writing or content strategy within a product organization. And kind of like her point here is like coming back to process. Like, you know, you might spend a lot of blood and sweat and tears and work and negotiation and 1,000 meetings, but the language should really feel effortless. You know, the user, when they get to the final product, you know, they shouldn't have to work to read it. So at Airbnb, I work specifically on our host products. So if you've traveled on Airbnb, you're probably really familiar with, you know, the homepage and searching for a place to stay, but unless you've hosted, you're not familiar with this whole other side of the product. And so hosting is challenging for many reasons because, you know, first of all, like, we're asking people to, you know, invite strangers into their home, you know, people that they've never met. We're asking people to put their most personal places, their spaces, like pictures of their home up on a website. You know, so this is kind of a lot to convince some people of. Hence where it comes in where we need to garner their trust. So, you know, this starts with onboarding in many cases, you know, and I think of it as kind of like a courtship. You know, you don't really know that much about each other. There's kind of a gradual reveal of information, you know, such that like you understand something about each other at the right time in order to make a decision. So there's a lot of ways to do these, going back. Sorry. Here we go. All right. So this is kind of like, people call these all different things, like FATUIs or NUXes, like first time user experience or like warm welcome or unboxing. This is what I worked on at Google for Inbox, the Gmail app. And I'm not going to like overgeneralize about the value or non-value of these types of experiences. I'll just say that from, you know, our research, you know, people tended to not engage with this content. They just swipe through. Why? Probably because we're getting in the way of what they want to do, which is to get to their email. So, like, I think like kind of what I learned from these is like maybe in some cases, in this case in particular, like having feature education when in context, when people are actually trying to do something is probably more effective. Another way that we do this at Airbnb, you know, this is the onboarding for new travelers to create an account. So like animation and some friendly copy can make, you know, the experience delightful, and hopefully it doesn't stand in your way too much. So I want to talk for a second about User On Board, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. If you're not, it's a site where they do kind of like UI teardowns of different onboarding experiences. And the reason I bring them up is because I would say like 85% of their comments are on the words that are on the sites. So it's really interesting to see that it's so inherent in their critique that the words are part of the design, they're part of the user experience. And I would also say that what's really interesting about them, it's not that they start with what we would traditionally think of as like, oh, this is the product onboarding moment. They start with the homepage, they start with the marketing page, like whatever the like first page is, and they start to analyze the inconsistencies in the language and the ways in which the UI jumps around. So they're really looking at the entire experience in a way that like, sometimes organizations aren't set up to properly design such that they're consistent. Because I mean, like you have all of these different like groups within companies, you know, even within Airbnb, and they're all potentially contributing to different pieces of this user experience. And it's all supposed to like roll up into one onboarding journey. So, I mean, you might have a sales team and they're writing macros, or they're writing like, you know, they're speaking to different leads. You might have a marketing team that makes a site and then they get handed off to the product. And so the way that this is handled in a lot of organizations is it's different teams creating different pieces. So how do we make sure the pieces all fit together and tell one story? At Airbnb, we have this additional component of the offline experience, which is like, you know, when you travel on Airbnb, like the most important part, the most important interaction you have with our company is not when you're in the app or on the product, it's when you're out in the world, like experiencing the trip. And we can't control that. So again, like you have all these different kind of like components that people are building, and they together should add up to like one cohesive onboarding experience, hopefully. So part of the way that we try to do that at Airbnb is kind of like through this concept of storyboards. So we have like throughout the office these storyboards for both guest and host, and they illustrate kind of the actual trip that like both a guest and a host would be going through. And The reason why this is kind of cool and effective is because, first of all, it's like a company-wide artifact. Everybody understands this, everyone gets it, everyone references it. It helps us to also think about the emotional journey of the people that we are designing for. And also, like, it just kind of rallies everyone behind the idea of story, which is a total buzzword. And everyone likes to talk about story. And with good reason, I think, because story, I think, is really innate to who we are as human beings. Like, we have no choice but to process and understand the world in sequential order. You know, we see things through space and time. So understanding story, you know, for designers and writers is very important. And here, like, if you took, you know, high school theater, you're probably familiar with Freytag's Pyramid. This is very much the archetypical story. You can find it, like, in Hollywood films. You can find it in Oedipus Rex. It's just a very convenient way to map back story. So again, back to the narrative user experience that Jessica coined. So, you know, I think as designers and writers, we're not just designing a product experience per se, but kind of like the meta experience, the like interior monologue and the emotional journey of the people who are going to be using your product. So I want to look specifically at an example, which is basically like the host onboarding process at Airbnb, and some of the ways in which we try to tie everything together and also be mindful of an emotional journey that hosts are going through, or prospective hosts. So right now, if you go to Airbnb.com and you click on Become a Host, you will probably land here unless you're in a test, in which case I'll show you where you'll land. This is like the front page of the field to start to become a host. We ask you right away to start putting in your information, and we don't tell you anything about hosting. So this works part of the time because, you know, people are signing up to host. You know, you might get sent to this page, which is airbnb.com/host, or you might find this independently. It's got a little bit more information on it. So the problem is, like, there's a lot to know about hosting. It's not like a low friction sign-up activity. But you may or may not be finding that information. So that's kind of a problem. And how do we make sure that we are curating the information in such a way that you find it and it makes sense to you and it's not overwhelming? So hosts have a lot of questions. You know, these are just some such questions. And it becomes very quickly overwhelming. So it's our job as content strategists to work with the design team to figure out that they have the right information at the right time. But how do we prioritize this information? So basically what we did, or what, you know, I did as a member of the content strategy team, was a couple months ago, before we kicked off kind of this redesign that we're about to look at, because this is all building towards like a redesign of our onboarding experience, was pull together a lot of the different teams that were writing or designing things for hosts. And at Airbnb, this is, you know, product marketing. This is CX, which is our customer experience or kind of like help support team. This is content. And this is our hospitality team. We had kind of we have a dedicated operations team that just helps hosts. And together, we devised what we think is the host story. So kind of the way that we do this is we think about their emotional state throughout, the questions that they might have that I had alluded to earlier, and then like kind of just like point of communication saturation, like how much stuff can we tell you at what time before you're just like hands up in the air and you can't deal with it anymore. So what this kind of boiled down to is like basically breaking down the onboarding experience into these component parts. And for each component part, we actually had within each of these categories, these subcategories, like atomic pieces of information, like what we thought was like one piece of information that you needed to know at this point on your journey to becoming a host. And so I worked with a designer, and we actually mapped this out through, and this is actually a much bigger, here, this is a much bigger diagram. It goes way this way and way that way through the whole host journey, and looked at like every single email and every single like product touch point, and you know, and mapped it back to make sure that we were actually accountable for all of these things that we want you to know. And the reason that this was helpful is because then we were able to look at things like product emails and push notifications and these different pieces of communication and say, okay, like, is the language consistent here and here? Like, we decided that, like, this is a point where hosts might be stressed out, so maybe we don't want to be telling them this thing, maybe we should tell them this thing here. And also, from a visual perspective, it helped us realize like the points in which like the visual vocabulary was breaking down and things weren't like looking and feeling consistent. So, as I mentioned earlier, like this was kind of like the beginning of a larger redesign of, that's still underway, of how like new hosts sign up on Airbnb. So one of our early metaphors was TurboTax, which at first sounds like a little bit unlikely, but it really works because if you think about it, like taxes are kind of emotional. I personally, like, I kind of block out after I do my taxes. I'm like, I don't remember anything. And there's also just like, there's a lot of inputs, like you're putting in a lot of information. It kind of takes a long time. It's something that you might leave and come back to, and such is the same with signing up to host. And so kind of the way that I thought about the content strategy for this entire flow, and pardon to the designers in the room, I'm not a designer, these are my sketch files. I thought of this as kind of like a funnel or a triangle in which at the beginning of the flow, like it should feel really fast, you should feel really confident because we're asking you stuff that you know and that you can answer quickly, like how many bedrooms do you have? Like where's your place located? And then towards the end, the content kind of flexes and it gets bigger because we're talking to you about much more complex concepts like pricing and pricing variability and market demand, and like, you know, booking settings and things that you just might not be familiar with. And so coming from the school of short beats good at Google, this made me nervous. But we were also very careful about how we structured the help content in the flow. And so this was kind of an exercise or like where I was trying to kind of demonstrate visually how, like what the emotional journey is of the host throughout the flow, and like where the points, where the help content should help elevate it from like points of fear, worry, and insecurity to like net excitement and accomplishment. And so again, I was worried about like, oh wow, you know, we've got a lot of things that we're telling people in like a small amount of real estate. But in user testing, people consistently said to us, like, we want more tips, I want more information. They were incredibly hungry for more, for just more reassurance, really. And so, like, you know, in particular, this was a kind of a different type of product than what I was accustomed to working on, in which people were very amenable to reading. And so these are not final designs, but this is just kind of a preview of mock-ups of like what we are working on. And this is kind of like the help metaphor that follows you around throughout. And so like these tips will come up and kind of, you know, kind of talk to you throughout the flow, if you will. So this is all coming back around to emotion and the fact that Airbnb is a very different type of product in that it's more experience than product. So emotion plays a really big role. So Rebecca Solnit has this really lovely essay in her book, Men Explain Things to Me, that I think kind of alludes nicely to the role of emotion in UX and kind of the responsibility of designers and writers to embrace the uncertainty. And, you know, as I was talking about earlier, like, the kind of part of our challenge is like proving that writing is a technical skill and that it's a design discipline, but that it's also an art, but then also like being able to live within an organization where everything must be measured with data and quantified, when sometimes, you know, we just have to get comfy with the unquantifiable. So this is actually from a piece from a colleague of mine named Matt Gallivan, who is a user experience researcher. And he, you know, of course, I'm never going to discount the importance of research, but rather he's kind of framing up here what it is and kind of giving it a little bit of context, that it's one factor among many that should inform design and content. And some of those other factors are instinct, good sense, like just an idea of narrative experience, kind of emotional intelligence. And I think that we really have to trust in those qualities and in those inputs that aren't easily measured. So then back to Travis Gertz. Humans are unpredictable mushy bags of irrationality and emotion. So, you know, I think that what this makes me think about is just really kind of like speaking in a human voice, and how speaking in a human voice is kind of like, you know, the beginning point of starting to garner trust. So part of the way that we think about this as a content team and as writers at Airbnb is we have voice principles. And so these are our voice principles. We are always heartfelt, curious, and inspiring. And voice principles are really meant to be like the embodiment of a brand. They are our personality. We don't deviate from our personality. We might, when talking to, depending on the audience, depending on the circumstance, our tone may modulate, but our voice remains the same. And I mean, I think that, probably an example of when voice principles did not come through might have been with the snafu that we had with some advertisements in San Francisco about, I guess, 2 months ago. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but we were definitely off voice, and people got very upset. So this is powerful stuff, like sticking to your voice principles. And so I just wanted to throw in a few examples of brands that I think are doing a really good job of like using a really human voice to speak. And so this is Karma, which is it's kind of like a Wi-Fi device, and also Bloom That, and they send you flowers, and it's totally delightful to use and a joy to read. And so these are kind of like from their marketing front pages where it might be a little bit easier to like inject humor or voice or personality. But then looking at the actual like in-product UI experience, this is Hello.is, which is a quantified self app for sleep, and they again, do a great job with just using conversational language and humanity to make themselves, wonderful to use. But I do kind of want to temper that recommendation with also an idea that a former colleague of mine at Google, John Zarowski, had. He is a writer and a design fellow at Google Ventures, and he writes sometimes for Fast Company. And he's written a lot of things on kind of like tips for good interface writing. And he's really unique because he is a designer who his kind of secondary career is as a writer, which I think is lovely. But he wrote, one of his tips was personality doesn't matter as much as you think. And I think that this is important because I think people kind of get themselves kind of tied up in knots about like having personality and, using kind of like, a friendly brand voice like within their product, when those moments will reveal themselves and they'll come up. And there are times in which like just kind of being straightforward, when clarity is the most important thing. And so like these are some screens from actually the current listing your space flow to become a host on Airbnb. And these are moments in which, we're asking you to make kind of tough decisions about your booking model and your calendar. So like really the words should be in service in helping you feel confident about your decision and being totally clear about your options. And we have to trust in those moments that your personality will come through. So I want to end with kind of a grander reflection on the power of language. Paul Kalanithi was a neurosurgeon and writer, and he wrote this book called When Breath Becomes Air. And it was actually about his diagnosis and then like the time in which he was dying of cancer. And so he's kind of reflecting here on kind of the power of words to form relationships. And this is kind of goes to the heart of why I love writing and why I love words, because whether you're speaking to a loved one or you're speaking to the people who are going to use the product that you're designing, the words that you choose are super important because they're establishing a relationship. And I think that again, it's just important to, remember like we're designing for human beings. And I think at Airbnb, like it's a little bit different because we have this luxury of, though we're designing experiences for a screen, like we can really prioritize getting people off the screen and out into real life where the living happens. And, real life is messy and inconvenient and unpredictable, but I think that like what excites me about my job is like that clarity in language can really just serve to get you back to life. So that is all. Thank you. Questions or discussion?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So there are some companies that have the luxury of having a content team, a dedicated content team. What would you say to people who do not have a dedicated content team? How can they work with the principles that you spoke about today? Any tips, tricks?
That's a good question. She asked me, like, how do companies who do not have a dedicated content team, how can they kind of integrate some of these principles and tips? I mean, I think a lot of content strategists would disagree with me a little bit because I think that there's kind of a school of thought of like, no, we do all the writing and we have the expertise and we're going to do it versus giving people tools to be able to do the writing themselves. And I think at Airbnb especially, even though we have a content team, we can't do all the words. So part of what we have to do is give people tools. And so, I mean, I think that that's kind of the beauty of, because, you know, everyone writes, like whether or not you're good at it, you write text messages, you write emails, you're constantly composing words in the world. So, I mean, I think just kind of like having, like, I mean, maybe starting out with something as simple as like having a few voice principles, like what's important to you as a company, like, and it doesn't have to be like 3 adjectives. It can be like, you know, 5 pillars of like, this is what's important to us and how we communicate, and kind of expanding it beyond like just writing to like how we communicate, you know, and thinking about it like that, I think is kind of a good first step. And then I would say also just like, you know, kind of empowering yourself to, you know, to just do it, to do the writing, like to look at examples from other people, from other companies that you admire, that you think are doing it well. And then always just asking yourself and other people, like, is this ultimately good for, is this helping serve the goal that my users are trying to accomplish? You know, because sometimes I think even though that seems like a really simple question that should be top of mind, I think that that's easy to get lost, because sometimes it's serving our goals as a company, not the people's goals that we're designing for. So I think just having that constant check will, you know, just by nature make your writing and your content better.
So what's actually the process? How do you work together with the visual designers or the UX designers? Because I still have like the impression that in a lot of companies, it's like the designers designing something, put lorem ipsum, and then you have to put some text in it, and it doesn't seem to be like the optimal process for actually writing meaningful content.
Yeah, that's a great question too. It actually differs from project to project. Kind of ideal dream world is that we sit down at like a product's inception with the designer, and we're actually developing content with them. Because I mean, depending on what the project is, because in some cases it's a much more content-heavy project. Like we have cases in which I'm working right now on something about like hosting standards. Like how do we communicate with hosts about what we expect from them to be good hosts? That's really what I feel like a content first almost project, where we have to come up with, okay, this is what we want to say. And then we work with the designer on like what is the best way to deliver this via an email, you know, via a notification, and so forth. So that's ideal. I do think that, you know, the lorem ipsuming, it definitely still happens, and it's just the way that we work, because I think just by nature of the fact that this is an emerging field, like I think that we have to be pretty game to just work in any way that we're asked, and then like kind of along the way figure out like more optimal ways to be collaborators more earlier on. Yeah.
I'm curious about voice principles, and how do you surface what your company's voice principles are, and how do you validate that what your first draft is of what your voice principles are is actually leading to truly what the voice principles are?
That's a good question too. We're actually kind of in the process of that right now. And I think part of the way that we do this is, like at Airbnb we have a lot of different teams writing for guests and hosts. And so it's really like a collaboration with like brand and customer experience and product and hospitality, because and even like policy. Like we have to talk to people about public policy. That's kind of like a very different message than what people might be expecting to hear from Airbnb. So I think like to start like just in developing them, it was important to get everyone in the same room so everyone's considerations were heard. Because, you know, we didn't want to just develop something that works only for brand and feels very brand leaning, but doesn't have something or a way of expressing itself for other teams. And I think the other way that we do this is, and we're in the process of doing this now, is, you know, they're kind of a tool that we give teams to empower themselves and to interpret as they need to for their output. So like the policy team has kind of taken this guidance and they put together kind of a policy like writing guide, because they have very specific types of examples and feedback that they want to weigh in on. So, I mean, I think kind of like giving them to teams, and also like I think, you know, just basic like good internal communication among the people who are writing is really key. So that makes sure that ensures that we understand what we mean by inspiring. That we don't mean like inspirational speaker. We mean like empowering. You know, so I think that that's another way to make sure that they're effective is just making sure, like, and this is just tactically, like, you know, Slack channels and emails and meetings that keep all the writers on the same page, you know, and talking to each other. Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned about the first time UI not being so effective, and the solution you had showed there had like a help button, kind of a tick button on the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Has that been through testing, and how's that going? Is it working?
Yeah, it's actually, that was kind of the quote that I showed afterwards. Sorry, I'm supposed to repeat back the question. He is asking me about like how the kind of help metaphor for our lister space redesign was working. Yeah, it has been through testing, and the kind of like the reassuring and heartening thing is people are like, oh, give me more of that. Like they really want to read it. And so kind of the way that we are dealing with it now, because like the example that I showed you was mobile. So since we don't have a lot of room on mobile, I actually wrote cues for cases in which like the tip is very must know and should appear on the screen, and others in which you activate it yourself. So that was kind of a feedback that came out of our research. And then for the desktop experience, they're always there because we have a little bit more room. But yeah, like we actually, we made the tips more granular, more detailed, and a little longer after user research because people were like, tell me exactly what to do. Yeah.
And do you let the user get rid of the tip at some point? I mean,
Yeah, no,
So
they
that it
can
doesn't-
engage with it and it goes away. Yeah. Or if they click the screen, it will proceed. Yeah. So it doesn't just like stand there blocking what you're trying to do. Well, if anybody wants to email me or follow up with questions, or if you'd like a copy of my slides, please holler at me and I'll be around and we should talk more. Okay? Thank you.